You know, somehow it really does not seem like it. It's gone by so fast, but it is the 20th anniversary of the Gulf War. This morning, a very special event was held at the National Infantry Museum honoring those who died in that war. And I'm honored to have retired 4-star General Barry McCaffrey and Colonel Greg Camp here to talk about this morning's event. Gentlemen, thank you so much for agreeing to be with us on the Dee Armstrong Show. I know you're very busy and lots of people want to talk with you. How was the event this morning?
It was spectacular. We had thousands of people turned out for it. It was a bunch of things at the same time. Number one, of course, it was recognition of 20 years since we lost almost 400 killed in the first Gulf War, almost 500 wounded. So we wanted to make a point of providing a memorial, which Greg can talk about, of pavers with their names etched in granite. So there's a permanent memory of their sacrifice. Then in addition, Dee, we get to watch a graduation of one of the new infantry companies. So a bunch of 18, 19, 20-year-old young men, most of whom were 10 when 9/11 happened.
Wow.
And so here they've stepped forward in a time of war to defend the country and protect America. So it was a moving, beautiful day, all out at the Infantry Museum.
It was information about the past and then looking ahead with the soldiers now. And those pavers, Colonel Camp, there are pavers in different places around town. They are so effective, especially when it's in a well-manicured area. It becomes a place where you can just come and sit or stand and remember.
Well, that's, I think, what makes this so special, is the National Infantry Museum is a national treasure right here in our own community. You know, we honor our war dead mostly in Washington. The Vietnam memorial's there, the World War II memorial's there, the Korean War memorial's there. There's a wonderful memorial in Kansas City for World War I veterans. What we did today was create the equivalent of that memorial right here in our own community for Desert Storm families and Desert Storm veterans.
I was there covering that event. Extremely emotional. Their departures and their arrivals coming back. I'll never forget it. Never forget it. What was your participation? Were you participants in the war, either of you?
Well, I was privileged to command 24th Infantry Division during the war, Dee, and it was the better part of 26,000 soldiers, one brigade of which came off Fort Benning, Georgia, the 197th Brigade.
Yes, my father's.
Yeah, exactly. So this community was involved in that. The media of beautiful Columbus covered it closely, shared everybody's anxiety about the coming attack on Iraq, and then rejoiced when it happened so successfully and so quickly.
And it was a great victory. How was it so decisive and so quickly?
Well, I think that General McCaffrey's mentioned this before. It started with the naval and air power of the United States of America that literally devastated and destroyed the morale of the Iraqi army, the fourth largest army in the world at that time. And then I'd let General McCaffrey tell you, since he was a first-hand participant, about the 4-day, 100-hour Blitzkrieg War.
Well, I tell you what I can remember, soldiers surrendering and asking for sandwiches and asking for candy bars live on television. The Iraqi soldiers just, I give. Will you give me a sandwich?
Well, I think it was a combination of a lot of things. Those were good Muslim boys. They were sad about the rape and pillage of Kuwait. They were terrified of Saddam Hussein and his brutal regime. And then they got 30 days of being pounded by the U.S. Air Force, by Naval Air, Tomahawk missiles, Marine Corps Air, and Army Aviation before we finally attacked. And when the attack went, we had this genius General Schwarzkopf, Norm Schwarzkopf.
Oh, yes.
So the mission of this 197th Brigade out of Fort Benning in my division was called the Left Hook. So we attacked 400 kilometers up into Iraq and basically turned the flank of the Iraqi army. They started to come apart, and thank God that minimized the loss of life on both sides.
We were so tremendously relieved that it was executed so well, and that God just gave us the victory there. Now, what do Gulf War participants think of the missions now? What do you think in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Libya? Is that something you are at liberty to talk about? Or?
Well, sure. Of course, this post is continually deploys elements. Almost all the individual replacements for the entire U.S. Army in Afghanistan are trained here at the Fort Benning before they go overseas. Every week, 300, 400, 500 deploy. So I think we're all aware that, look, this war is different. It's gone on for almost a decade now. We've had 49,000 killed and wounded. It's a huge struggle. I think the participation in Iraq is coming to a close now, and we hope successfully. It looks as if Iraq may make it as a law-based state. And Afghanistan, we got a lot of work to do, and it's a very dangerous, complex situation, as your viewers know.
When you're looking at the training of our soldiers now, compared to training 20, 30 years ago, is the military doing what it can? Is it getting better?
Yeah, I think that our training took a permanent stand up about 1980. We created a number of things. One was the National Training Center, one was performance-oriented training, one was the Mission Essential Task Lists. And since that time, I think that our senior leaders in the training environment, Fort Benning is a huge training post, have done an unbelievable job of preparing our soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines for the combat that they face.
Dee, I might add to that, you know, the other thing, you could see it in the drill sergeants out in the field this morning when the infantry company graduated, and then the officers of that training battalion. A lot of these soldiers now have grown up in combat. You know, many of them are on their 3rd, 4th, 6th, 7th combat tours.
Wow.
There was a Ranger Battalion, 3rd Ranger Battalion major there, and he's been essentially continuously deployed for 5 years. So the training is not just in the here in the United States at this rapidly growing Fort Benning Center of Excellence now. As you know, the armor community is coming here, thank God, finally to bring us together. But it's also taken place in combat.
I've recently talked with and featured a female soldier about the role of women in the military. And I asked her, are you afraid? And she said, it's not that I'm not afraid, but I trust my training and I trust the soldiers around me.
Well, I didn't know, Greg probably wants to comment on it too. I had a daughter who was a major in the Army, so I'm you know, sensitive to the issue. The Army is stronger because we have women in uniform. And as we watch their performance, particularly in this war on terror, where we've had lots of them killed and wounded, and they're out there in every possible fighting position except direct combat ground arms. But they're flying F-18 fighter aircraft, they're coming off carrier battle groups, they're flying Apache helicopters. Women make terrific soldiers. We're basically getting the top 10% of women in the country are in the armed forces, and the top 50% of men. That's a way to look at it.
Awesome. Now, what can we as a community in Columbus do to show our men and women in the military that we're for them, and we want to make their lives, because they put their lives on the line. We want to do what we can for them.
Well, I think the first thing that you already have done in this community, or we already have done in this community, is to have the vision and then the drive and the perseverance to create this national tribute to the soldiers who have gone through Fort Benning for almost 100 years. The National Infantry Museum could not exist in any other community except for Columbus, Georgia, in my opinion, and that's because the citizens of Columbus truly do care deeply about the soldiers. And as they continue to support the National Infantry Museum and its mission out there to honor the legacy of valor and sacrifice of the American soldier, they continue to show that support.
I don't know where this came from, but just brought me to tears thinking of my father. My father deployed to Vietnam several times. And he loved the military. And when he came back, he was never the same. But he never blamed the military.
Yeah. Is he still with you, Dee?
No, he eventually died from his lung disease. But just watching some of that video and just thinking, you know, and I have a stepson who just joined the military, and I'm so proud of him. I said, Michael, why do you want to do this? And he said, I want to serve like my dad served.
Yeah. Well, God bless them. I mean, the legacy, the example of those Vietnam veterans, and there's 3.5 million who served in Vietnam. Huge losses, 58,000 dead, 300,000 wounded. And of course, many of them came home with other injuries.
Yes.
The so-called PTSD, traumatic brain injury. We're seeing a lot more of it now in this terrible combat environment in both Iraq and Afghanistan, where IEDs, explosive devices, cause devastating injuries. But I think the example of the legacy of people like your dad as Vietnam veterans you know, it influences the next generation. And thank God American boys and girls will step forward and defend us.
Yes. Well, gentlemen, I would love for you to stay, and we'll talk more after the break. More to come with General Barry McCaffrey and Colonel Greg Camp on the Dee Armstrong Show right after this.
Where at least I know I'm free, and I won't forget the men who died, who gave that right to me, and I gladly stand up. Where at least I know I'm free, and I won't forget the men who died, who gave that right to me, and I gladly stand up next to you.
Well, we are continuing our conversation with retired four-star General Barry McCaffrey and Colonel Greg Camp about the 20th anniversary of the Gulf War. And it's bringing back memories for so many of us.
Sure.
It just brings back a whole thought process about life in the military. Just like to ask you, gentlemen, again about the new is it actually, and the pavers, what is that going to look like?
Well,
a little bit more about that.
Let me tell you what prompted this. We looked around. We have a gallery in the museum called The Last 100 Yards. It's a theater that depicts the Desert Storm War, and it plays itself every 7 minutes. And as we looked around the nation, because we already have a strong affiliation with the Desert War, we couldn't find any place where there was a national recognition of those who had died. There were some community recognitions throughout the country, but there was no place where they were all honored in one place. So we decided to create this national memorial, and the granite paving stones seemed to be the right thing to do. But we also have a granite pedestal monument with a large bronze plaque on there that depicts the war. And above these granite pavers, we commissioned a specially designed flag, which was raised today ceremonially for the first time by General Ron Griffith, a fellow division commander with General McCaffrey in the Desert Wars. And it will fly permanently over these pavers. So collectively, this has become the national tribute to those veterans and those families of Desert Storm.
Very powerful. If you have not taken your children to the museum, or if you haven't been yourself, they must go. And give yourself some time, because this is something you should not walk through very quickly. And prepare yourself, because it is an excellent, excellent museum. The stories that are told, were you pleased, or I should say, how pleased were you to see the final product?
Well, you know, I've been a supporting effort. The leadership of Greg Camp and Ben Williams and Carmen Cavesa, who is well known here in Columbus, the city manager, and General Ed Burba, who used to be the commandant at Fort Benning, and lots of other folks with a tremendous generosity in the state of Georgia to help pave that. That's a $100 million effort, and it's, as you say, it's so powerful. And I would hope that all of these families, particularly those that have a veteran or have a young woman or man in Iraq or Afghanistan, come out and see it and spend half a day or longer. It's quite a profound experience.
Going through it, walking through it and reading the stories. I'm trying to give people an understanding of what it is. These are real stories, details about different scenarios in the war theater. And you have persons walking through with you, describing what's going on. It's almost like words cannot describe the effect that you're going to get by being there.
Greg, you might mention our volunteers in the storytelling.
We have 300 volunteers that help us run that. We could not run this facility without our great volunteers. And they take visitors on educational tours up the last 100 yards, which is our signature exhibit from Yorktown to Baghdad, as American soldiers for 236 years have earned and protected the liberties that we all enjoy in this great country. But you know, Dee, I would go back to when you were talking about your father and you were talking about your son. The primary mission of this is to teach millions of visitors over the years that freedom isn't free.
Is not free.
And about those like your dad and your son and many others who have earned it and protected it for all these years.
Yes, the price that they pay is often, it's not on the outside. I can remember, and I know you've heard these stories, both of you, but him going to sleep and waking up in the middle of the night, screaming and hollering, and he would not go to sleep without a gun. That was a battle with my mother. It's like, Otis, you cannot go to, he said, I'm not going to sleep without a gun. It changes you forever. And yet he always taught us to respect our country and to respect the military. Yes.
Well, you know, one of the things worth mentioning, Dee, on that ceremony today, which is so powerful, and first of all, it's fun to watch the parents watching their boy, who's now finished 10 weeks of training in the U.S. Army. Some of them don't recognize their own son. They're so clean-cut and such good physical condition and so respectful because of the drill sergeants. But in addition, we had there the leadership of the other services. So we had the General Chuck Horner, who commanded the air power in the Gulf War, and Admiral Stan Arthur, who was in command of this massive U.S. Navy effort. 6 carrier battle groups are out there supporting us. 2 of the World War II battleships were still in action. And we had Lieutenant General Bill Keyes, a senior Marine officer who commanded the 2nd Marine Division. So we tried to also remind everybody, those pavers that Greg Camp talks about recognized all those killed in the war: Army, Navy, Air Force, Marine, and Coast Guard.
And I want you to know that we did have a news crew out there this morning, so stay tuned for the news at 6, and again on Alabama First News perhaps at 7. We will have some of the video and the information so you can see some of that. I have a military question. Do you have any guidance for military designers of wars in the current day? Any advice as to what we're doing now that could be done better? Or?
Well, of course, I work for NBC News, and I have a lot of advice or observations. You know, look, to some extent, we got to be grateful. Certainly the first Gulf War. You know, in my remarks today, talking to this terrific group that assembled there, I reminded them what we owed to President George Herbert Walker Bush, a World War II 18-year-old carrier pilot, and what we owed General Colin Powell, who, you know, the background, he was wounded in Vietnam as an infantry battalion commander. So when he looked at this giant strategic and political challenge, he was seeing real soldiers. Or this brilliant commander, Norm Schwarzkopf, who actually led the campaign. And then, you know, so but it wasn't just generals and admirals. Of course, at the end of the day, it's infantry soldiers, Marines, young people flying F-18 attack aircraft. That's who won the war. So it's worthwhile at this infantry museum, as you go through it, reminding yourself there's 307 million of us in this country, the wealthiest country in the face of the earth, and we won't stay that way unless we have these brave young people who step forward and fight for us.
Well, thank you so much for being with us. I'll give you an opportunity. Any closing remarks, gentlemen?
Well, thank you so much for having us here, for honoring this memorial that we conducted this morning.
It's a pleasure.
Good to be with you, Dee.
Thank you. It was a pleasure. I thoroughly enjoyed it, and it's been an honor.